Welcome to the Wise and Happy Life podcast, where ancient wisdom meets modern science, and mindfulness, philosophy, and happiness practices blend with neuroscience, compassion, and common sense. Hosted by Bob Martin, meditation mentor, happiness coach, trial lawyer, and entrepreneur. This podcast explores how to live with grace, presence, and purpose in a complex world.
Hey, hello everybody. Hello, good people. And welcome to another episode of A Wise and Happy Life. And as you know, I always like to start out setting the scene for our guests. And I want to tell you a little story about one day that my wife Connie and I were in the kitchen. And we're both cooks. And, you know, sometimes they say too many cooks in the kitchen, but we usually get along. But we had a little disagreement about how to move forward with this particular dish. And she turned to me and she said, "Look, would you just let me be chief of the kitchen?" And so I said, "Okay, fine. So fast forward a couple of days and we're out in the garden and we're trying to figure out where we want to put the bluebird house. I said, "I think it should be over there." And she said, "I think it should be over there." And she turned to me and she said, "Look, would you just let me be chief of the garden?" And I looked back at her and I said, I don't think you really want to be chief of the kitchen, or I don't think you really want to be chief of the garden. I think you just want to be chief." She goes, "Now you're beginning to get it." So I tell you that story because I want to introduce you to Tigrilla Gardenia, a true chief of the garden, maybe, because from her perspective, it might really just be the plants. This is going to be a fascinating, eye-opening podcast that's really going to bring you to looking at life a little bit more broadly. So, Tigrilla, please. Tigrilla, I'm sorry. Tigrilla.
No.
Please. Well, names are important. Getting them right is important. I once had sometimes I do meditation classes with foster kids. And there was this one kid who had an African name, and it was extremely hard to pronounce, and I got it wrong. And he looked up at me and said, "Mr. Martin, I usually get upset when people mispronounce my name, but I know that my name is safe in your mouth." And I said, "Oh, so sweet, so sweet." So Tigria,
That's it.
the
You
Spanish
got it.
pronunciation, Tigria. Okay, please tell us a little bit about you and your relationship. Well, tell us a little bit about your story and how you came to be where you are.
Ooh, that's
Oh,
so
that's what on many levels, right?
exactly. As you're like, where do I start? Where do I start? First of all, I start by saying thank you. I'm super
Uh-huh.
excited to be here. So yes, my name is Tigrilla Gardenia, and I am a nature-inspired mentor and a certified life coach. But probably the thing that intrigues people the most is this title that was given to me of World Ambassador for Plant Advocacy. And as you said,
Wait. A world. Say it again.
World Ambassador for Plant Advocacy.
Yeah, let's not pass over that so quickly. A world ambassador for plant advocacy. So
Yeah.
cool. So cool.
Yeah, it
Mm.
was a title that was given to me actually by two separate people, which was sort of funny. It started a little bit with plant intelligence, but then it really is more about plant advocacy. And it's because I work very, very closely with the plant world. I work with them as mentors, but also as models, but more importantly, as collaborators and co-creators. And I think that aspect of bringing plants into the conversation, not as objects, not as resources to use, but really for the intelligence that can hold and for all of the knowledge and experience that they have, and how, they've watched us as humanity grow up and are pretty much always with us. I mean, it's very rare for you to be in a place that doesn't have some plants nearby. And so working closely with plants has allowed me to sort of step out of the human-centric reference point, the idea that we as humans are the end all be all and we have all the information, which is hysterical that we think of that with all the situations and conditioning and difficulties that we have. Where instead, if you look outside to the plant world or even in your own house, you'll see that plants embody resilience, adaptability, evolution. They embody so many different characteristics. What it takes to take a crappy situation and turn it into something amazing, how to thrive, when to, live, when to actually allow yourself to die. I mean, there's so many different aspects that plants share with us. And so from the moment that I started working with the plants after a chance encounter with a musical plant that sort of instantly put me into this, oh my goodness, you're actually paying attention to what I'm doing, not just sitting there and doing your own thing, completely changed the way that I approach life.
You know, um, so you know, from what you say, the first initial reaction of so many people must be, "Well, it's a little bit woo woo," right?
Hmm.
And but you live this and you experience this, and this is your honest and authentic experience. Um, people say the same thing about things like Tai Chi and acupuncture, but science is finding out that these things are all true. So, before we get into some of the details about plant intelligence, which really I'm just dying to hear, tell us a little bit about how you came to be so involved and what opened you up to these to this plant intelligence. What? Yeah.
So for me, it was, like I said, a chance encounter with a musical plant, which was, I live in a place called Damanhur. It's one of the largest spiritual eco communities in the world in northern Italy. It's basically a cross between Hogwarts and Oz, to just give you an idea. And and we're very well known for the temples of humankind, which are underground cathedrals that we built into the mountains here. Amazing kind of three-dimensional works of art, but also of really a passage for humanity. And one day I was here and I was walking. I was walking in another area in our historic capital, and I heard this music. Now, here's where I'll play with the whole fact of I'm an engineer, so I have the mathematical, like engineering sort of logical mind. I also am, over the years, have now become pretty much a scientist or a science communicator. But at the time, I heard this music, and as a music engineer and electrical engineer, I was like, what is this sound? Because music has always been the thing that has helped me understand the world. And so I was very curious when I heard this music, and I followed the music to a speaker that was connected to a box that was connected to a plant. And, like this understanding of this plant was using this box to make this music. And as I listen to the music, another thing that I love is languages. And we always think of music as a form of, as a language, but in reality, it's the opposite. Language is a musicality. It is music that's actually our core essence, our root, that frequency, that
Whoa, whoa,
vibration.
whoa. Slow down, slow down. Okay. Let's go back and take that
Pause.
yeah, pause. Take that a chunk at a time because I think what
Yeah,
you're saying is really important and I don't want it to be breezed over.
fair.
Okay, go.
Okay, so let's start with the concept that music is not, it's not that music is a language. I mean, it is in a way, but it's that language is a musicality. Language itself has tone, has melody. It is that we learn, and that's how we give meaning to things. So when I heard this music, it was as if the plant, or it wasn't as if, it was the plant speaking to me. I was standing there, the plant was perceiving me, and I'll get into the science of that later,
Mhm.
but the plant was perceiving me, and in that perception was, and we were in relationship, and through that relationship, the plant was changing the music that I was listening to. And
So,
so,
wait, just
yeah,
going back to what you said about the musicality of language, we kind of recognize that when we say things like, it's not what you say, it's how you said it.
absolutely.
Uh huh.
Absolutely. That's a great way, because you hear the inflection, the tone, the melody, the what's inferred in between the words. And that's how music works in general. We simplify it when we think about language, and we can make it much more complex when we think about a symphony. But I walk out of that symphony with a deep understanding of something, right? There is a transmission that's happening in that way. And so through this device called the music of the plants, which in my community we've been working on since the late 1970s, we've been able to create something where through the electrical response of plants, plants are able to then communicate through music. Sometimes it's performance and you can hear it, where the plant's like, I don't care who's listening, I'm just going to make music. And other times it becomes conversation. It becomes a way for us to interact with the plant using a language that we understand, which is this language of music.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, this was kind of eye-opening. Like it was an instant conversation where now I'm looking at this plant. There's something in science called plant blindness, also called plant disparity disorder, where we don't see plants in the world around us for everything that they are and everything that they give for us. So all the ecosystem services, everything that they provide, we don't see it. It becomes this sort of blob of green in the background, which is kind of interesting because green is the color that our eyes pick up the most. We actually have much more detailed receptors for different shades of green because of this relationship that we have with plants.
Hmm.
And so from there, I just had to know everything. How are you doing this? How does the box work? Why is it that you're doing this? Is there any science to it? Like, is this just hocus pocus? Is this woo woo, like you said? But in reality, since about 2006, there's a new field called plant neurobiology, or sometimes called plant signaling. And in this new field, which is very controversial, it is the understanding of the inherent intelligence that plants have. We're starting to finally recognize that plants aren't just sitting there creating oxygen for us and that's it, but plants actually have complex lives that interpret and understand the world with a really fine precision and need to make decisions on that because being sessile, which means they can't run away, rooted into the ground, plants have to deal with what's happening. Plants can't just say, oh no, you're bothering me. That's too much sun. Can you just turn the sun off for a little bit? That can't happen. Plants have to adapt. And they've had to adapt to many different kinds of animals, including humans. So when we start working very closely with plants, we start to recognize that there's an entire blueprint for life that helps us understand presence. It helps us understand mindfulness. It helps us understand sensory overload in an entirely different way. And working with plants, we can start to better understand our own senses and how we might be picking up way more than we expected. And we tend to think that that's woo. We try to put it into the sense of like, oh, that's just like something subtle, but it's actually not. There is electromagnetic fields that plants have wonderful receptors that can teach us how to deal with electromagnetic fields in our own body. Plants also recognize pressure, gravity, sunlight, versus different ambient light, like indoor lighting versus sunlight, because that's the difference between heliotropism and phototropism. So we start to recognize that we as humans are also much more complex. And it's perfectly natural to be complex. Like there's nothing wrong with being that complex. And sensory overload doesn't come from something is wrong with me. It comes from the fact that I have a number of senses that are extremely awake, and yet I have no reference point. There's no book that teaches me how to use them. There's no like lessons from my parents that helped me understand it. And many of them have been stigmatized and to thinking that, oh, you're just too sensitive and there's something wrong with you, when it could very well be that this physical sense is actually extremely open and you have no mechanism to close it. You've
Whoa,
never
whoa,
been
whoa, whoa.
taught.
Pause,
I know,
pause.
I get off.
No,
Pause. You have
no,
to
no,
keep
no.
hitting the pause button.
Pause. Let's just go back and review some of those things because that was a lot of information.
Mm.
So let me see what I picked up. So you're saying that we think of plants like they're just simple little creatures that, maybe they can turn to the sun, but that's about it.
Right.
But they're actually much more complex than that. And that may be a bias that we have, wanting to think them to be simple because we consider ourselves to be superior for our complexity. I think this is what I'm getting. And
Yep.
that there's nothing wrong with being complex, and that one of the things that you've learned from plants is that they take in a lot of information and are pretty good at handling that information, in contrast to the human being, which has all of these sensory inputs. I mean, we're talking sight, sound, touch, thought, consciousness, all of this stuff, which is highly complex. And unlike a plant, which has figured out how to deal with the sensory impulse, well, nobody ever taught us. And
Hmm.
so we tend to get overloaded by that impulse, by that input. Am I kind of
Yeah.
following you?
That's a great way of putting it. Absolutely. I mean, you have to think that we've been taught pretty much since birth, focus on one thing at a time.
Hmm.
But the world doesn't pause because I'm trying to focus on one thing at a time. So what happens? I'm trying to focus on one thing and the rest of the world is going on around me and I'm getting overloaded because this stuff is still coming in. Now, when it comes to those 5 main senses, maybe we learn a little bit more how to shut them down. I can close my eyes, I can wear earplugs, I can do that. But if I come from the same evolutive strand that plants come from, is it possible that I actually have many more senses that I have been throwing into the woo or talking about as like they're just these feelings, and that this is the cause of much of my overwhelm,
Ah.
right? My overwhelm is the fact that I do pick up electromagnetic senses. I have a sense somewhere. My body has a sensor for electromagnetic frequencies and electromagnetic radiation, and I don't know how to deal with it. Is it possible that my body, which we know my body does have a receptor for like for sunlight, it's called my skin, right? My eyes also pick it up in a different way. And so all we know how to do is cover my skin or not cover my skin. But what if there was other ways to deal with that and other kinds of areas?
Do I'm just A question comes up in my mind.
Please.
Do you think that I guess the word is obviousness, or the intensity of our five senses um, kind of overwhelms the subtlety of the other senses? And are we living are we living in kind of an evolutionary mistake, because those other senses were much more important in a more primitive environment, where we weren't bashed over the head with sights and sounds and machinery, and things that would not be present in. I don't know. Well, I guess what I'm saying
I,
is that the present life that we have, the modern life, is sensory overloading, whereas in a jungle situation, which is more simple, the subtleties of those other senses would be more engaged because the environment was more subtle. Am I making any sense here?
yeah, you are. I think you're onto a really interesting concept, which is at what point did we start focusing on these 5 senses, which
Uh,
are pretty much the senses that are easy for us to believe in? In other words, when I try to think about pressure, I wasn't always that I had if you think about what you were talking about, like indigenous cultures, um, there are indigenous cultures that have a whole sense of abilities that we in modern society don't have
uh-huh.
because we haven't thought to have a use for it. We've kind of like weeded them out of our uses and also of our vocabulary. For example, there's a tribe, which unfortunately I can't remember the name of, that has excellent sense of direction. Excellent sense of direction. They always know which way is north, south, east, west, but because their language itself doesn't have our language is self-referential. So if you notice, I just said our language, right? It always refers to me. Their language is in absolutes. So it's like you don't say, I'm going to move forward, which is, of course, referential to me going in a direction. They will always say, you're going to go whatever, northwest 70 steps, because not being self referential has allowed them to continue to evolve that acute sense of direction, which is probably a sensor in their body somewhere that is picking up. It's kind of like a compass. It acts as a compass and it says, due north is here. So therefore, due east is this and whatever. I think as time has progressed, we have, and we've separated out scientists know things, non scientists don't know things. And this separation continues to separate us from our environment. And we focus only on the things I can taste and touch because they're directly relevant to me. And the other stuff becomes, woo, I
Hmm.
don't,
Hmm.
where are you? They becomes intuition.
Yeah.
It becomes a gut feeling. And yet we're getting more and more science that is confirming that gut feeling is a whole series of microbes in your gut that are actually responding to things. And that's where it's coming from. So when you work with a plant who has no judgment of you, they're not looking at you going, oh, silly human. They're not thinking that way. There's no thinking right or wrong. There's more of, is this useful right now in the environment in which I'm in? And how do I develop that? Then all of a sudden, I have this non judgmental partner who helps me see the world with more granularity and allows me to then start to shift my perspective and understand that this world is more complex and that I can navigate it using not just what I see, which, if you think about our language, going back to language, almost all of our language references sight. I need to see the plan forward. I'll see you tomorrow. Seeing is believing. We have all these expressions where to believe requires sight. And yet we then neglect all these other intuitive kind of senses, which are really also picking up more from the environment around us.
Mm. You know, I, I'm on board 100%, because one of the things in meditation classes that we work at doing is developing more relationship with our intuitive self. And when I say intuitive, what maybe in a more pedantic or a more common way of talking, there's one side of our brain is very rational and very verbal and very mathematically oriented. The other side is the one where we experience things like awe and beauty and connection and spirituality. We feel what Christians refer to as thin spaces, the place
Mm-hmm.
where you feel almost in contact with the divine force. That side of our brain, which is, and we don't give it the credit, it is as intelligent and as powerful as our rational brain, but we just give all the energy to the right side. And sometimes the left side starts to atrophy a little bit. It starts to, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I think that one of the things we try to do in meditation classes is to reactivate the use and to develop a feeling of trust for that undefinable, non-verbal, I think this feels right part of us. And what I'm hearing you saying is that is almost the natural way of being for plants.
It is,
Now
and
that's
it's
cool.
really
Now that's
and
really
it's
cool.
and it's hard, and you said it perfectly. It is the natural way also for us to be. This
Mhm,
whole separation between kind of the rational and the intuitive. Even going back to the science, there's a lot of science coming out now about the reason why going out and spending time in nature, why it is that the more that we're immersed in natural environments heals us and helps activate parts of us to that physically combat against disease and certain types of cells and such, is awe and wonder. In other
mhm,
words, awe and wonder is the thing that bridges that rational and that intuitive. They are kind of both two sides of the same coin. And we keep separating out, like saying you can only be one. I'm not saying you, I'm saying in general, you can only be rational and you can only be intuitive. But you're a great example. You lived a one chunk of your life being extremely rational in the work that you did, and now you're in this part where you're focusing way more on the intuitive, but it's because they are both sides of the same skills, the same openings, the same sensors, like we were talking about. You're just tapping into them in slightly different ways to
mhm,
get slightly different results. And I think that that's what working with plants helps us really understand, is that we are part of an ecosystem. We are beings of nature. We forget that, but we are beings of nature.
mhm.
And when I tap back into that, all of a sudden those two sides of the coin become visible to me. And I can now flow between both of them. I use science to give me insights into things maybe I don't understand yet, or that I don't know are there. And then I tap into them with other senses
Mm.
so that I can validate them for myself. It's not the science that validates whether or not something is true. That's part of the fallacy. What validates is my sensation of it, my ability to feel into that piece so that I receive this information that makes something possible. The arts is the same way. Art allows me to imagine, to dream, to think of something that is unbelievable. And oftentimes, art leads to scientific inquiry, that creativity that makes me go beyond the borders of what I think is true, and then I can imagine and play with it, and then bring that into the science to test it and confirm it with my instincts, with my intuition, with my senses that say, yes, this is true for me.
Let
It
me ask
brings
you a question.
everything together.
Yeah, yeah, let me ask you a question. So when I was a kid, I was a big science fiction fan. I read all the science fiction books I could get my hands on and the like. And, interestingly, if you look over the centuries at science fiction, there's very little that has been imagined that hasn't come into reality. And
Yep.
in fact, one science fiction author once said, "If you can imagine it, it is possible." And I'm wondering it is whether your experience your experience no, I'm going someplace else. Excuse me. Let me just back up with what I'm speaking to, I suppose, is, do plants lead you to the idea that the intelligence that we experience from our intuitive side and the intelligence that plants are able to utilize really is a connection to a much broader field of intelligence that we tap into?
That's a
Because
oh,
because
sorry.
because how could the science fiction author, and I kind of buy into the idea that if you can imagine it, it's possible, but we couldn't know that unless we had if we could tap into what's possible because of a greater intelligence field.
So this is a
I,
great, great question. I'm
I'm
excited. I keep
I'm so ooh, I'm
chomping at the bit, chomping at the bits.
chomping at the go 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 go.
So the reason I'm excited about it is because this is a big field of discussion that we have here at Damenher. So in Damenher, we work a lot with spiritual physics, And spiritual physics helps us understand the cosmology of the universe. And one part of the cosmology of the universe, of the way that the universe is developed, is through something called a series of synchronic lines. The synchronic lines are the energy centers that come into our solar system through the sun, and then pass through all the planets that can include that have or host human. And by human, I don't mean like this humanoid form. I mean human as in a divine spark, a human being. It's something that's much greater. But all of the planets that host human life, because we believe that there are many planets that host life in many different forms that all share this divine spark. Those synchronic lines include and host the souls as they come into the solar system, but also, we believe, thought. In other words, everything we've ever thought about anything, any being, anywhere has ever thought gets sunk into these synchronic lines. As human beings, we also have the ability to create original thought, but original thought is something that's like you have to really be evolved in order to create completely 100% original thought. The point is that exactly what you're saying, all beings, of all living beings, we believe, are touching these synchronic lines. The synchronic lines come into the earth, they come out into the skies. There's approximately 9 in each more or less direction, like going sort of north or south, and then east west. But they really do zigzag and twist and turn all over the place. We have different maps available for the ones connected to earth. And therefore, the answer to your question is yes, we all step into this field, this synchronic flow, and we pull out things. And one of the things that we as humans are very good at doing is taking all of this and mishmashing it into new directions. But we also see that from plants. And if so, in some ways, I think the amount we can do that, like the capabilities we have, probably it's hard to measure. I believe we're the same. What I find that is beautiful is that plants give us the example of what we could create if we weren't so conditioned to think that change is bad. Because when a human being is born with something completely different, I don't know, 6 toes, we automatically assume that that's disease or a problem, something to be changed. When a plant grows a strange leaf shape that relates back, or a beautiful new color, we are excited. We're like, wow, what just happened in the environment that you created, instead of a leaf that's shaped like a little bit of a heart, but one that's more triangular and now has like some kind of striation on it or has something on it. We get excited about mutations when it comes to the plant world. So they're free. They don't have that conditioning. We, on the other hand, do something completely out of the ordinary and something is wrong.
Mm.
It's either considered disease, it's considered bad, it's to be changed, and that's all conditioning. So our ability to actually create new has been stunted,
Stunted.
totally
Mhm.
stunted.
Stunted. Well,
Yep.
let me ask you another question. We're running out of time, and we're going to make this part one, and we're going to continue on in part two. But before we end part one, I want to ask you. I would love to ask you to distinguish between the concept of a all-encompassing divine force versus the kind of divine force that most folks, well, not most folks, but many folks in the West perceive as a separate from me divine force, something that I pray to, that that
Mhm.
reflects back and can look at me and perhaps even judge me or evaluate me or the like. Could you distinguish between those two concepts?
Yeah, probably the easiest way I could try to describe it is that in the way that I look at it is that that larger divinity that we tend to think of as even more remote, right? The creator God,
Hmm.
in our philosophy is, imagine that that creator God is actually inside of everybody, right? So
Ooh.
we have a little tiny piece of that creator God inside of each one of us. And so therefore we're all part of the same, no matter what belief system, religion, any of those things. In order to access that shard, that divine spark inside of us, we create these other types of divinities, these lower level divinities that give us an access point connected and congruent with ourselves, with the way that we think and we process and our belief systems, to access that larger divine spark, that creator God that actually lives within us. In other words, I'm looking outside of myself to better understand myself as a mirror. And when I touch that part of myself, I can then access the full creator God.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. That's great. Thank you so much. Okay.
Simplify.
Okay. I want to thank you for your time, but folks, this isn't it. Please tune in to part 2 of this, where we're going to get into a deep conversation about plants and how they think. And I want to give a little forerunner of the first question that I'm going to ask you, and that is, some people say they have a black thumb and some people say they have a green thumb. And can you talk to that? And Tigria is going to answer that question in part 2. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you on part 2.